Thank you so much, Susan, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for hosting me. It's a great pleasure. Thank you all for being here. It's an incredible pleasure for me to be back in London to give a talk here. I think my journeys as a historian began here in London about 20 years ago. I've been coming back and forth. London is a kind of mecca for Armenian studies people, in my opinion, especially for historians, because it's so rich in archives. The British Library is here, the National Archives, and one could spend a whole lifetime at the British Library and still find enough things about Armenians and others to keep oneself busy. So thanks again for the invitation. Thank you all. I will be talking today about my second book, Early Modernity and Mobility. Just came out a few days ago officially through Yale. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into my talk, and then at one point I'm going to discard my notes and improvise with the PowerPoint. So in his L'origine de l'imprimerie de Paris, published in Paris in 1694, André Chevillier, a librarian at the Sorbonne, recalls how an Orientalist colleague of his, told him, quote, that an Armenian had shown him in Paris a book he had brought from Persia that he claimed those of his nation had printed in their own language, unquote. The author's reluctance to believe that Armenians in 17th century Iran could have published a book in their own language is a telltale reflection of a popular perception or misperception in early modern Europe regarding the craft of printing.
Dear, please, can you pass the slide so you can see also?
I'm sorry?
Can you put the next slide?
Yeah, I can do that, but I'm not quite there yet.
So sorry. I'm really sorry.
Oh, no problem. So scholars of print culture from Chevillier in the 17th century down to Lucien Febvre, the founder of the Annales School of Historiography, and Henri-Jean Martin, his partner in writing in the 20th century, and more recently, Elizabeth Eisenstein and my colleague Niall Green have at one point or another asserted that, or implied that the printing revolution initiated by Gutenberg unfolded on a, quote, European or settler European stage. Chevillier once again reinforces the exclusively European nature of the printing revolution, and I quote here from his book. It is true that the printing press has left the bounds of Europe and has made itself visible in some cities of Asia and America, he writes. However, the people who have hosted it have not been other than Christian Europeans who live in those parts of the world and who have carried there the tools of printing through which they are placed into the hands of idolaters, the books of the Christian religion, those lines, unquote. In the same passage where Chevillier expresses doubts about the possibility that an Armenian book could have indeed been printed in Iran, he notes that the Carmelite missionaries had tried to import a printing press into Isfahan in the early years of the 17th century, but had failed to publish any books due to the dry climate of the country. That indeed 3 separate Armenian-operated presses flourished in the Isfahani capital of, in the Isfahani suburb of New Julfa, Norjura, from 1636 to 1692, followed during the next century by several Armenian-operated presses in the Indian Ocean world, as well as in Ejmiadzin in present-day Armenia, would have probably struck our Frenchmen as quite preposterous. So my book, Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800, provides a missing counterpoint to largely Eurocentric retellings of book history shaped by unexamined assumptions passed down from early writers like Chevillier to the 20th century giants in the field of l'histoire du livre, Relying on the methodological insights of the Annals school, but globalizing its Eurocentric or national unit of analysis, my book examines the rise of printing centers beginning in 1512 in Venice and ending in Astrakhan and Madras in 1794, across the mostly port city seascapes of the early modern Armenian diaspora. In all, Armenian-run printing establishments operated across 19 separate locations during the Gutenberg era of printing, the overwhelming majority of which were in port city locations where Armenian long-distance merchants specializing in luxury commodities such as raw silk, diamonds, textiles, spices, and so forth, had set up tiny but affluent diaspora nodes. Yet, the story of Armenian print culture told in this book does not focus solely on printing establishments. My aim is not to write yet another linear narrative of the saga of Armenian printing presses, concentrating on the history of the printing establishments themselves and their operators as ends in themselves. Rather, I have sought to use an histoire du livre exploration of Armenian print culture and the production of the printed Armenian codex to tell a much larger story. I have utilized print culture as a lens and optic through which to explore the making of early modern Armenian diaspora following the forced mobility and deportations that drove Armenians from their ancestral lands across the oceans and seas and port cities of the burgeoning economy of archaic globalization. The story of the Armenian printing revolution, told in my book, was no doubt shaped by the port city structure of the early modern Armenian diaspora and came to be fashioned by its trans-regional networks of circulation and mobility. Both manuscripts and books circumnavigated this diaspora, as did merchants and sometimes printers or their printing instruments. My account of Armenian book history was in part inspired by reflections on books by the Trinidadian novelist and writer V.S. Naipaul, whom I don't usually cite because I don't share his political views, but whose writing is nonetheless quite beautiful. Choosing to place stress on what he called the, quote, mundane side of things, unquote, Naipaul noted in an article he wrote for the New York Review of Books in 1991, how, quote again, writing is a private act, but the published book, when it starts to live, speaks of the cooperation of a particular kind of society. Naipaul framed the act of book production in a wonderfully effective and evocative way, and I quote here again from a passage from that same essay, and he says, "But books are not created just in the mind. Books are physical objects. To write them, you need a certain kind of sensibility. You need a language and a certain kind of language, and you need to possess a particular literary form. To get your name on the spine of the created physical object, you need a vast apparatus outside yourself. You need publishers, editors, designers, printers, binders, booksellers, critics, newspapers and magazines, and of course, buyers and readers," unquote. What I like about this meditation is its hard-nosed emphasis on the materiality of the book, on the simple fact that to materialize before readers, books need a vast apparatus of printers, publishers, binders, book manufacturers, distributors, and so on. In Early Modernity and Mobility, I have tried to apply this kind of Naipaulain sensibility in my retelling of the story of the Armenian printed collections. So let me now switch to saying a few words about the methodology I use in the book, which, as I alluded to earlier, is largely indebted to this French historical school of knowledge production known as the Annales School of Historiography, founded by Marc Bloch and his partner, Lucien Febvre. And of course, this approach to the history of the book that the French Annales School started in the 1950s is known as l'histoire du livre, and it has its birth in this very important book, an image of which you can see here on the right side. It's a famous book by both Febvre and Martin, which appeared in 1956 or 58, and which has generated a very long tradition of scholarship that focuses not on printing presses, not on printers and so forth. It doesn't really bother itself too much with fonts, types, etc., or paper quality and size, but rather looks at the book as an object, as a semiotic object that is released into society and that is consumed by readers, and that ultimately deeply shapes a reader's mental horizons. And so the French school of Histoire du Livre usually focuses on prices of commodities, prices of the book as a commodity, distribution networks, peddlers, and others that distribute the outcome of the book itself, the material object that Paul has been alluding to in my passage, and how, most importantly, the book itself changes the reader's mental perceptions and their place in this world that we live in. And so, in short, the French school of historiography on the history of the book is referred to by one of the heirs of the Henri-Jean Martin and Febvre School of Historical Thinking, Roger Chartier, who's a famous French historian of the book. And in a famous essay that he gave as a keynote address to the American Book Association, if I'm not mistaken, Chartier wrote about what he called Frenchness in the history of the book. It's an essentialism which he admits himself, but which nonetheless describes a certain sensibility of how the French school differs from other schools of historical writing when it comes to print culture itself. And so in my book, the introduction of my book, I devote considerable space to looking at the methodology of Histoire du Livre, and I, at the risk of dabbling more into the essentializing tendency of Chartier, I also coined the term Armenianness as a kind of counterpart to Frenchness. And of course, by this, what I mean to say is that the Armenian school of the history of books is really actually a history of printing presses. It's not the history of books. It's a school that has produced very important works over the last century. My favorite historians among them, for sure, are Leo Arakel Babakhanyan, who's probably done more than anybody else to really put the history of the Armenian book on a mental kind of horizon of its sort, of its own, and that has influenced me deeply. But there are others as well, such as Raphael Ishkhanyan and so on, and others, both in the diaspora as well as in Armenia. But nonetheless, to distinguish the French approach, the Frenchness of the history of the book from the Armenianness of the history of printing, I just want to reiterate some important differences. These differences can be summed up in a few words by saying that the French school, for instance, relies on a different variety of archival and other sources of information to craft its own analytical narratives of how the history of the book has come about and how books themselves have become objects that have become tremendously transformative. And so the French school looks at documents like archival documents, notarial records, ledger books of printers, detailed correspondence by printers, very important source, epistolary correspondence, and so forth. The Armenian school, on the other hand, has focused, for understandable reasons, or has privileged the study of colophons or hishatakarans, which are one of the most incredible sources of Armenian book history. Every book that was published from 1512 until 1800 had equipped in itself, in the back usually, with a short colophon or hishatagaran, which was a carryover from the manuscript era. And there you have very important information on the publishers, sometimes on prices, but very rarely so, and so forth. But as important as colophons are, they don't really allow you a wide lens to look at the social, societal kind of background, the kind of Napoleon apparatus outside of the printer. So I place myself firmly in the camp of Frenchness in terms of looking at particular types of sources. I privilege ledger books, epistolary correspondence of printers and publishers. I also privilege particularly notarial records, because notarial records tell you a great deal about how printing itself was not just a one-off thing. It involved this incredibly complex apparatus of cooperation involving numerous types of people who partook in the act of publishing a book. So that's as much as I'm going to say about the methodology for now. I want to now focus on the three spools of thread that make up the spine of my own book, on which luckily I have my own name. Actually, yes. And so these spools, which I think are somewhat new, that deserve to be talked about, at least in passing here, are threefold. First, one contribution I make in this book, which is, I should have said 10 chapters, 12 chapters long, some might say too long, 585 pages, and consists of work done in 33 archives and about 10 different cemeteries, mostly in India and other places. So in these, across these 10 chapters or 12 chapters of the introduction and the conclusion, I basically introduce, I think, several things that are somewhat novel. And these are, the first is what I call the birthing of the early modern Armenian diaspora. By early modern, of course, I am referring to a periodization scheme that historians have created over the last 40, 50 years or so, world historians in particular. And it's a shorthand term that refers to the period in world history, global history, that begins, roughly speaking, for the world at least, 1500, and spans until the late 1700s. So it's 1500 to 1800 when it comes to a global lens. In my rendition of this for Armenian history, which I think is a quintessential case study of early modernity itself, hence the title of the book, I argue that in the Armenian case, the early modern period begins not in 1500 as such, but especially in this small window of time in the closing years of the 16th century that extends from 1597 to 1607. So I'm going to have to ask someone in the audience to mute themselves because we can hear them in the background.
I'm muted now, sorry.
So anyway, so in the Armenian case, I argue that the early modern period begins in 1597, roughly speaking, and begins there in the late 16th century and ends in around 1800, after which, of course, the modern period begins. And so in this period, which also happens to correspond, strangely enough, with the Gutenberg era of printing done through wooden hand presses that were complex to operate and so on. I'll show you some images later on because it's important to see the actual machine itself to realize that it had its own limitations. And so this period begins, I argue, with twin detonations of forced mobility and migration that shook up the region of Eastern Asia Minor, Anatolia, Eastern Anatolia, if you will. I realize these terms are loaded and sensitive for some people. Western Armenia, the Armenian Plateau, you can choose whatever label you want, but it's the region on the eastern fringes of Asia Minor, which seems like a neutral geographic term. And in that region where the Armenians live, and where their ancestral homeland is situated, there were twin detonations, which I'll talk about in a second, which birthed together the early modern world of the Armenian diaspora. So I'll talk about that in a second. The second important, I think, contribution I'd like to highlight here for the purposes of this lecture has to do with what I call the shift from scribal to mechanical reproduction and the PPP connection. I'll tell you about what the PPP connection stands for in a second. And lastly, arguably, in my opinion, at least for me, the most challenging and interesting contribution is my argument that one simply cannot understand Armenian book history and printing without taking into account what global historians have for the last several decades called confessionalism or the confessionalization thesis. And I'll describe this in a second as well. And here in this connection, particularly towards the last half of the book, I argue that to understand printing or print culture, one cannot do so without confessionalization as an optic to keep in mind. And more importantly, perhaps, one cannot understand, I would say one simply cannot understand or fathom the birth of modern Armenian secular nationalism without squarely tackling the issue, the elephant in the middle of the room of the early modern period, which is this kind of confessional strife, interconfessional strife between Armenian Catholics and Armenian Gregorians or Apostolics, as they are known afterwards. And this is part of the confessionalization thesis. So let me begin with the first of the contributions, and first of the arguments that have to do with the twin detonations of forced mobility that I've been alluding to. And here, of course, the twin detonations of mobility, as you can see on this map, and I don't know why there's my map is being blocked and I can't really, let me see if I can unblock it. Yes. So this is a map I had designed based on particular instructions to visually represent what I call the twin detonations that led to the formation of the early modern Armenian diaspora. And these twin detonations are essentially, on the one hand, this period in early modern Ottoman history, which is known as the period of the Jalali uprisings or rebellions. Jalali or Jalali, depending on how you pronounce it, refers to a group of bandits that were running amok on the eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire at least in the Asia Minor Peninsula, which basically resulted as a consequence of a perfect storm of crises that almost brought the Ottoman Empire to its knees. And this crisis had to do with had an economic angle to it. The Ottoman akçe, or the silver currency, was devaluated because New World silver from the mines of South America had flooded into the Ottoman Empire, therefore leading to uncontrollable inflation, devaluation of the currency, and the Ottoman Empire itself was unable to pay its troops in a way that would maintain order. And this, in combination with a few other crises, it was like a perfect storm, a conjunctural perfect storm of developments that were global in nature, not regional or specifically to the Ottoman Empire, but global, which had to do with massive influx of silver, massive damage done to the region as a whole by this phenomenon that historians refer to as the Little Ice Age, which basically refers to global climate change and the cooling of temperatures in the Ottoman Empire during this period, particularly in the region where the Armenians lived. Temperatures plummeted, and the result of this was that there were massive crop failures, famine resulted, people were without resources to feed themselves and so on, and at the same time, rebels were basically in charge of the regions in the east and had wrested these regions away from the central government's control. And of course, the result of all of this in the period from 1596 to 1606, especially, but the period is longer. It's from 1590 to, some people would take it to 1640, but I'm focusing on a 10-year period. The result, the net result of these Jalali uprisings was what Ottoman historians call the Büyük Kaçgın, which refers to the Great Flight. So during this period of upheaval in the east, tens of thousands of Armenians, along with even many more numbers of non-Armenians, fled the eastern regions of the Ottoman Empire in Asia Minor and sought more safer places of habitation in the West. Many of them went to Istanbul, Constantinople, others went to Izmir, Smyrna, and even more others went to Rodosto or Tekirdağ, which is right outside of Istanbul. And this, in a way, paved way for the emergence of what we call today the Western Armenian Diaspora, where I think it's fair to say a good number of us in this room can trace our ancestry. At least I can. So the Great Flight resulted in the formation of the Western Armenian Diaspora in consequence. And the thing that makes this crisis particularly destructive and creative at the same time for the Armenians is that the Jalali uprisings did not occur in a vacuum. When they actually occurred, they also triggered another kind of crisis that had to do with the confrontation of the Ottoman Empire with the other gunpowder empire of that period, that is to say Safavid Iran, where Armenians were living, but in very small numbers. But in the course of the Jalali uprisings, perhaps the greatest, the most competent, if one will, from the perspective of rulership, of Safavid rulers, Shah Abbas I, 1587 to 1629, if I remember his dates. Shah Abbas I seized the opportunity of the Jalali uprisings and the uncertainty, instability in the Ottoman realm to recoup losses that his predecessors had suffered at the hands of Ottoman sultans, who had grabbed more and more chunks of Safavid territory to the east. And so in 1603, Shah Abbas I, as is well known, and my first book is on this topic to a large extent, launched a blitzkrieg war against the Ottomans. And in the course of this war, when he realized in 1604 that he could not match the Safavid army that was dispatched on its way to quell the region in the east, he took drastic measures and practiced what historians call scorched earth policy. So he razed the entire region to the ground, burned the lands, and forcibly displaced up to 300,000 Armenians and others, not only Armenians, and others, from the region of the border region, the zone between these two empires, which happened to be where the Armenian ancestral regions were situated. He displaced 300,000 persons and forcibly marched them and resettled them into the inner parts of his realm. And of course, as a result of this deep deportation, which historians refer to as büyük sürgün, or in Armenian, it's also referred to as med sürgün. Sometimes it's called med darakrutyun. As a result of this, of course, approximately 10,000 or so elites of the Armenians in the east, on the eastern frontier of the Ottoman Empire, those elites who were specialized in the silk trade of Iran, the most important commodity that Iran had at that time, the raw silk. These elites from old Julfa or Hinjuha were given relative privileged treatment. Unlike the others, they were not taken to the silk-producing regions where many died of pestilential disease and so on, but were taken with relative care. Still, it was a very painful and traumatic, violent displacement, and resettled on the outskirts of the new Safavid imperial capital of Isfahan, where they built this suburb, which was almost a city, known as Nordjuga or New Julfa. And these merchants from there went on to establish one of the greatest trade diasporas of the early modern period. They became phenomenally successful merchants and came to, after the forced deportations, came to migrate or become mobile voluntarily in quest of commerce and profits, as opposed to being forcibly dragged out of their homes. And so my argument is that the early modern Armenian diaspora, which gave birth to print culture, which financed all the printing presses, which financed and shored up this print revolution that itself made a lasting impact on Armenian cultural history, itself was a byproduct of these two violent displacements. And that, interestingly as well, in the context of this twin detonation that I've been referring to, one side effect of these displacements was that the region of Eastern Asia Minor, historic Armenia, Western Armenia, no matter what you want to call it, which was dotted with Armenian scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied and manuscript culture, scribal production thrived before. As a result of these deportations, and also as a result of a century of constant warfare nearly between these two gunpowder empires, I think 5 or 6 wars were fought, and each time the eye of the storm happened to be in the region where most of the Armenians lived. And so I argue in the book that in part due to this violent kind of insecurity in the region, scriptoria were severely crippled, and manuscript production noticeably fell to all-time lows, that the number of manuscripts produced by Armenians almost vanished at that time. And this itself provided an impetus for the people who had survived and had gone on to become what I call port Armenians. That is to say, Armenians who were merchants and dealing with long-distance trade of commodities, luxury commodities for the most part, prestige goods as they call them. This kind of the collapse of the scribal centers and the absence of manuscripts, the famine of manuscripts, as some of the authors themselves refer to it, Sova, Serakirnerut's Sova, basically gave rise to this need to supplement the absence of manuscript production by resorting to a quicker, cheaper, and better way of producing manuscripts, but in a new form. And of course, what I'm referring to here is the printed codex itself. And so the printed codex came to rise precisely at the time when manuscript production drastically fell. And we have evidence, telltale evidence to demonstrate to us that indeed manuscript production had suffered a precipitous decline at this point, hence providing reason for the church especially to resort to the printing press, the technology, the new early modern technology of printing to make up for its losses in manuscripts. And of course, my whole argument in the book is that this itself is how, sorry, 1 second. This itself kind of paved way for what I call the PPP factor, the second point of contribution that I make in my book, which is basically PPP stands for Port Armenian, Port City, and Printer. Printers are mostly priests, high-level educated priests. Port Armenians, as I mentioned, are Armenians who are both Eastern Armenian from Iran, but also Western Armenian from the western parts of the Ottoman Empire, from Smyrna, Constantinople, and Tekirdağ, and so on, who themselves had become, like the Julfan Armenians, mobile in quest of profit and commerce after the initial dislocation and trauma. And so in both cases, what you witness, if you look at the map of the early modern Armenian diaspora that you can see here, is that in a lot of these locations, which are for the most part port city locations, you had the meeting up of both Eastern and Western Armenians as merchants living in port cities. So for a shorthand description of this, I have borrowed from the term port Jew, which is a very well-known term in Sephardic studies to refer to a similar phenomenon of Sephardic merchants who also congregated in port cities, but in their case, the history is somewhat more complex and different. But for my purposes, the term Port Armenian, I think, makes a great deal of sense because it's one way of describing both Eastern as well as Western Armenians, both of whom shared the geographic location of port cities and also the trade of luxury prestige goods, long distance trade. So in essence, my argument, or the second contribution I make is, the second argument I make is the PPP factor, the Port Armenian, Port City, and Printer factor. And of course, here I'd like to say a couple of very quick things about some basic facts regarding Armenian printing and print culture. So in all, between 1512, when the first Armenian printing press was established in Venice by Hagop Merabart, a mysterious man about whom we know virtually nothing, until about 1800, the last of at the closing end of the early modern period. Approximately 1,000 titles were published, mostly in Armenian, but also in a few other languages by Armenian printers. And of these 1,000 titles, if one were to give an average print run of 500 to 600, which would be, I think, reasonable, because in some cases the numbers were much lower. There were books that were printed only in 100 copies, in several cases 40 copies, almost like a manuscript. But if we average it out, I would say it gives us an idea of how many books were actually circulating in the diaspora at any given time or during this entire period. And the number would be somewhere in the range of 600,000 to 750,000 books. That's a significant number for the Armenian diaspora, given how small the size of the Armenian populations were across this vast, spread out, scattered diaspora. So in all, there were 19 printing presses. Some might say even 20, 21, I just noticed today. But in the book version, in my book at least, from which I've grabbed this graphic here, I've listed 19 printing presses ranging from Venice to Calcutta. And of these printing presses, if one does a tabulation of them, one will arrive at the figure of 15 locations out of 19 that were squarely in port cities or very close to port city locations. And so approximately 78.94% of Armenian printing establishments in this entire period were port city-based locations. And of course, anybody looking at the larger picture here would have to scratch one's head and say, what's going on here? Is this a coincidence that 78.94% of the printing centers are port cities, both maritime port cities as well as fluvial, that is to say, riverine port cities? Is this a coincidence, or is this just or is there some deeper synergy going on here that should tell us and invite us to think and probe into the synergy between port Armenians, port cities, and printers? And of course, I'm of the type who scratches his head and then says, yes, there is a synergy here. It's not just an accident. It's not just an ornamental side effect of what happened. And so basically a question then arises as to why Armenian printing presses were mostly in port cities. What was in the port city location that made printing so attractive to Armenians? Why did Armenian priests go to port cities to establish printing presses, and how did they do it? How did they cooperate with Armenian merchants to make this culture, print culture, come into fruition? And of course, here I argue that port cities and printers and port Armenians basically have three types of synergy that make it logical for port city locations to become the place where the printing revolution of the early modern period for the Armenians essentially took place. And these are, first, that ports and port cities were first and foremost the very basis of the early modern Armenian diaspora, Julfan as well as Ottoman. Most of these settlements were port cities, maritime or fluvial, but for the most part maritime. So that's one thing. If you wanted to be a printer in the early modern period and you were an Armenian priest who had the educational level to become a printer and know how to read and write and so on, and produce and cannibalize from manuscript culture into print culture, you would more than likely not establish a printing press in Diyarbakir or let's choose any other random place that's internal, land-based, away from the waterways of the world. You would likely choose to have a port city location as the place where you would establish a printing press, because a port city location was where port Armenians resided. They had community infrastructure, they had the money, the capital, and the willingness to support this revolution into existence. Secondly, ports also had the ability to attract technical experts who were trained in the arts that were necessary for printing to exist. If you wanted to have a printing press, I come from a family of printers. My grandfather was the first. My grandfather owned the first privately operated printing press in Ethiopia. I'm from Ethiopia originally. My father was also a well-known established printer in Ethiopia. So I'm talking about a topic about which I have some knowledge because I grew up with the smell of printing ink in my nostrils. So if you want to establish a printing press, you need to have font cutters, letter cutters. You need to have people who can engrave the letter shape and use that to create letter types. Those people usually were highly prized specialists, and they would exist in, more likely, they would exist in port cities than they would in interior locations away from the flows of the global economy. So Amsterdam would be a perfect place for that. For instance, Venice would be an even more perfect place. The third reason why printing presses were set up in port cities had to do with the fact that ports came with an infrastructure of communication and transportation. If you're going to be in the business of printing, and here I have to say, the major difference between the Armenian case of printing, the printing revolution, and the European case is that there are two differences. In the European case, in the mid-15th century, when the printing revolution began in Europe, in Mainz, Germany, and so on, what you had was a sharp and sudden increase in the demand for books because universities were popping up in all sorts of places in Europe, and because there was a middle class of merchants who were more likely to be literate than people who tilled the land, for instance. And so that was one reason why the printing revolution was successful in Europe. The demand was there for more and more books that manuscript and scribal producers could not simply match or keep up with. Even with revolutions and the style of manuscript copying, they couldn't meet the demands of the market. In the Armenian case, the opposite is what we have. What we have in the Armenian case is not a sudden rise in the demand for books, but we have the sudden decline and precipitous fall in the supply of manuscript books. And so this made printing a very viable option because it's cheaper in the long run to print a book through mechanical reproduction than scribal production. But to get back to the port and port cities PPP factor, the last point, what I wanted to emphasize here before I move on is that maritime transportation has always been cheaper and more efficient than transportation across land. If you're transporting books, if you're a printer, you need to make some kind of a profit. You need to make you need to turn some kind of a profit. You may not be able to operate in line with what has been famously called print capitalism in Europe. And I'm using here Benedict Anderson's famous iconic book called Imagined Communities, where he argued that print capitalism was at the core of the birth of modern nations. And he focuses on printing because printing was one of the first modes of capitalist production in Europe. In the Armenian case, you don't have that. You don't have print capitalism, simply because the marketplace of readers was too minuscule. The level of literacy was too low. And of course, the one over-determining factor in Armenian history, this is a general law that I've come up with through my teaching of Armenian history over the past decade or so, is that Armenians are small in size. Armenian populations have always been small, always. It's not an accident that Movses Khorenatsi says, although we are small, great deeds have been accomplished in our land. It's not also for accident that Baruch Sevak says, we are few, but they call us Armenians. So there's this thing with size that is really in the long term quite effective as a factor for looking at historical change. So size of Armenians population was very, very small, and even smaller were literate Armenians or literate people in general. Before the 19th century, there's no literacy, mass literacy. So if you're operating as an Armenian printer, you're not going to be operating on the premise of making a quick kill when it comes to profit making, unlike Europe, let's say. But you still need to sell books. You need to at least break even. Otherwise, you're going to have a long line of bankrolling merchants or people who were ready to give you money, even if there is no profit at all involved in it. So if you wanted to at least turn over some kind of a break-even point in terms of publishing books, you need to sell your books. And if you wanted to sell your books, it made sense for you to operate in a port city location because, for instance, in Amsterdam, because you would print books. It's a book. The book is a commodity, first and foremost. People need to purchase books, to read them, unless you're giving them out for free. And some people did, but you still need to break even at some point. So for that to happen, maritime transportation was very important. In Amsterdam, Voskan Yerevansi and his other printers moved to Amsterdam because of incredible supply of technical experts, paper manufacturers, letter cutters, punch cutters, and so on, for the actual printing press itself. But if you're also there, you're also going to be taking advantage of the fact that Amsterdam had the world's most efficient transportation hub. It was the center of the world system of the modern proto-capitalist system. It had a port system second to none. You could upload your books in crates and ship them from Amsterdam straight to the consuming centers of the Armenian book. And those consuming centers, of course, happened to be in the Ottoman Empire. The largest place of urban Armenians in the history of the world, up until that point, was in Constantinople. Constantinople, as a result of the Jalali uprisings, went from having less than a few thousand, maybe, Armenians in the 15th century to suddenly in 1604, after the Jalalis, 40,000 Armenians, because they were all fleeing the east. And then, of course, by the end of the early modern period, in the 1700s, late 1700s, Istanbul had 80,000 Armenians. It's the largest collection of urbanite Armenians in the world. And of course, urban Armenians are more likely to be literate than non-urban Armenians. And so the first place to send books, if you're a printer and located in a European port city location, would be Smyrna, Izmir, straight from Amsterdam down through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. And then the books would then be unpacked and loaded on caravans, and some would go east, while the majority would go northwest to Constantinople. So again, that's one additional reason why port cities were important. If you were transporting over land, you had to pay customs fees at every customs post and so on, whereas if you're actually doing a maritime transportation, you don't have to do all that. So I'm going to now I'll show you quickly two images of printing machines. The one on the left is the Gutenberg style press. It's a hand press, it's wooden, it's bulky. One has to disassemble it if you're going to transport it over land by caravans of camels. And Julfan printers tried to do this. Julfa had a printing press in 1636, as I mentioned earlier. And at one point, they did import a press from Europe, but it turned out to be quite a tragic story, but the press itself barely made it on camel. The Carmelites did the same thing before the Julfans, trying to import a press from Europe. But the problem with transporting Gutenberg-style press is that you'd have to disassemble it to put it on several camels, and then you'd have to have someone at the other receiving end who had the technical abilities of putting it back together. And so this made it unlikely for inland locations to be centers of printing. Whereas by the early 19th century, and here I should say that the technology of printing itself went through very few changes from 1453 until 1807, or 1809. In 1809 in Britain, probably right here, not too far from where we are, I'm not sure, a man named Stanhope invented a new kind of printing press called the Stanhope press. And you can see it here. It's not wooden, and it's actually much more portable. And the fact that Julfa itself had 3 printing presses until the 1690s, and then no printing press at all until 1860 something. And the printing press they got in 1860 something was a Stanhope-like press, donated to them by a wealthy Armenian from Java, if I'm not mistaken again. But anyway, so here are the locations, rough locations of the printing establishments. Most of them are port cities. Again, close to 80%. I've gotten some flack from some people for emphasizing the port city nature. People before that had essentially looked at the pattern, but hadn't seen the pattern itself, I would argue. But in any case, be that as it may, I will switch now to the second contribution of the book, which has to do with confessionalization in Europe and beyond. And confessionalization, of course, is a term that was coined by two German scholars, Heinz Schilling and Wolfgang Reinhardt, in the late 1970s, to refer to the momentous changes that shook Central Europe in the 16th century that usually tended to be studied under the labels of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, of course, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation that gave rise to the Council of Trent, Concilio di Trento, that basically together ended up making rigid boundaries that were porous between different confessions within Christianity. And in the course of the early modern period, because of confessionalization, led for the most part by the Catholic missionaries and so on, which had sent their missionaries across to West Eurasia, the Ottoman Empire in Iran, as well as in other places, they took what was essentially a European phenomenon known as confessionalization that led to rigid boundaries between confessions between Protestants and Catholics, Calvinists and others, and so on, and made confession the basis of state formation in Europe. This idea basically was expanded and was actually applied, I should say, through the creation of what historians call social discipline and identity formation. That is to say, the religious authorities at that time, coupled with state authorities, imposed strict censorship on books to clarify and rigidify boundaries between Protestants and Catholics, and later on, as we will see, between the Armenian Apostolic or Gregorian Church and their followers and those who had converted to Catholicism within the Armenian fold. Initially, the boundaries were actually fuzzy. It's difficult to say what really made Catholic Armenians different from Gregorian Armenians, but in the process of confessionalization, the boundaries became so clear that you had to know your place. Is this approach to confessionalization relevant to the world outside of Europe? Scholars have debated this for for at least a decade. And about a decade ago, more than a decade ago, Tijana Kristic, who's teaching now at the Central European University in Vienna, who's a friend of mine, Derin Terzioglu, Nir Shafir, and Guy Burak basically applied this concept that was Eurocentric initially to understanding religious change and new forms of piety that developed in the Ottoman Empire, and some would argue in other places as well, although the evidence for outside the Ottoman Empire is rather weak. It's really relevant, I would argue, especially for Armenians within the Ottoman Empire and Armenians in Iran as well, because both of these communities became targets of proselytizing by the Catholic missionaries who were beginning to make encroachments into the Armenian church's backyard. And so essentially Carmelites, Jesuits, and others began preaching and missionizing among Armenians in the 17th century. This led to the culmination of interconfessional strife, probably beginning in the mid-17th century. I would say 1639, if I had to choose a date. I would say if confessionalization is a hand grenade, by analogy, I would say that the pin of that grenade was pulled in 1639 when the Carmelites in what was then the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, in places like Lvov, where there was a very old standing Armenian community. In 1639, the Carmelites basically participated in the slow wresting away from the Armenian church of the Armenian communities in Poland. And gradually they became converted to Catholicism. And that itself left a huge consequence in places like Julfa in the Ottoman Empire, in Istanbul, Constantinople, and other places, because the implication of the need of the pin being pulled became only relevant or aware cognizant by the people themselves, by the Armenian church leaders in the late 17th century. So from 1680 onwards, from 1680 until 1800s, and one would argue even until the 19th century, the Armenians were, whether they liked it or not, were deeply implicated in confessionalization, which is a wave that was global, that affected not only Europe, but also large parts of what we call the Middle East today. And so this, of course, brings up the question as to why the Armenian church would be so threatened by the Catholic missionaries. And of course, they were deeply threatened, tremendously threatened. And the reasons for this have to do with some differences, theological, Christological differences between the Armenian church and the Roman Catholic Church. So at the risk of simplifying things, I can say that the differences between the two churches can be boiled down to one very important council that took place in 451 CE in Chalcedon or Chalcedon, right outside of today's Istanbul, in the region of Moda. I think it's a neighborhood of Istanbul. There, the Council of Chalcedon met in 451 to debate the important question of what was the real nature of the Lord Jesus Christ. Was Jesus one person? Was he two people in one? Did he have one nature or two natures perfectly fused together? And of course, the Armenian church did not have representatives at the Council of Chalcedon 451. They were busy with the Battle of Avarair that was being waged at that same time. And in any case, a century or so after the Council of Chalcedon, the Armenian church began to gradually drift away from the decisions made at this council on the nature of Christ. And so finally cresting or reaching a kind of crescendo in 607 at the Third Council of Devine in 607, when the Armenian church for the first time officially condemned the decisions made at the Council of Chalcedon on the nature of Christ. And this drove a wedge between the Armenian church and the Catholic Church. This was the first and most important difference that separated these two traditions. Other differences, of course, included such debates as the filioque controversy, that is to say, whether the Holy Spirit comes from the Father or from the Son or from both. The Armenian Church rejected the Catholic Church's notion that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Son. They argued that the Council of Nicaea that took place 50 years before was the right council, because they argued that that council decided that the Holy Spirit proceeds only from the Father. So that's another major difference. Another difference yet is the difference of whether the Pope is the supreme head of the Christian community. Of course, the Armenian Church saw itself as being led by its Catholicos. Of course, the Byzantine Church also split from the Roman Orthodox Church in the Great Schism of 1053, precisely not on Christological grounds, because they were the same basically, but on the grounds of who was the true leader of the Christian community, the Pope or the Patriarch in Constantinople. And of course, there are differences on other matters, such as the mixed chalice, whether you take communion with water being mixed with wine, or whether the wine had to be dry without any water. The Armenians are the only Christian tradition that emphasized and insisted that wine had to be broken with water. They had a mixed chalice tradition. And of course, Nina Garsoyan has a brilliant essay on this topic where she points out that this has nothing to do with theological issues. This has to do with the fact that Armenians are essentially, culturally speaking, part of the Parthian, kind of Sasanian, Iranian world, where water was always mixed with wine. Whereas in the Mediterranean, the opposite was apparently the case. But be that as it may, they also disagreed on fasting rules. The Catholic Church, for the Armenians, were too lax. They ate fish when they shouldn't have, or meat and so forth. Whereas in the Armenian Church, as many missionaries themselves noted, and it's really incredible to read these accounts, especially by French missionaries, where they say of all the Christians in the East, the Armenians are the most strict when it comes to discipline, when it comes to fasting and so forth. And last but not least, of course, both Catholic and Armenian churches have opposite and irreconcilable almost notions of what happens when a person dies. Catholic Church argues that when a human being dies, there are two kinds of judgments. There is a particular judgment that when you die, the judgment is pronounced and your fate is decided. You go either to, you go straight to heaven, you go to hell, or you go to purgatory. That's a 14th century concept, 13th century Catholic concept, or limbo, which is practically the same. Whereas the Armenian Church resolutely believed that there was no such thing as a particular judgment. For the Armenians, there's only one judgment, the final judgment, which occurs at the end of time. And so when everybody dies, when people die for the Armenian Church, they don't go to purgatory, they don't go to heaven, they don't go to hell. They go to this place called the Gayan, which is in the heavens, and which is a temporary place where souls are stored until the end of times, so that when the final judgment occurs, that's when, if you're on the right side of Christ in the Gayan, basically you're going to do well. You can go straight to heaven afterwards. But if you're on the left side, Sahort, Sinistra, sinister, you will go to hell. So, but that happens only when the final judgment occurs. So the Armenian Church vehemently objects to the existence of purgatory. So these are some of the reasons why the churches are different. And these reasons in the 1680s onwards became the grounds for printers on both sides of the divide, Armenian Catholic as well as Apostolic or Gregorian. The Armenian Church was not called Apostolic until the 19th century. It was called the Gregorian Church, or to be more precise, to emphasize the importance of confessionalism. Of course, the term for confession in Armenian is davanang, right? The term that was used for the Armenian Church in the 17th century during the period of confessionalization was lusavorcha davan. That is to say, of the faith or confession of the illuminator. Gregory the Illuminator being the converter of Armenians. So both sides went to use the technology of print to drive home the message of their own side of the confessional divide. Catholic Armenians resorted to the printing press. Many of them were wealthy and so on, whereas Apostolic Gregorian Armenians resorted to print technology as well, but this time through the support of Port Armenians to publish books. And that is why, if you look at the entire output of Armenian book production in this period, you will notice that 70% of all the books published in the early modern period are strictly and squarely religious and confessional, 70%. And the number actually goes up to 85% in times of Catholic Armenian strife. 1710s, 1720s, the worst period, and 1740s, the number of books goes up to 85% that were religious in nature, because both sides were using the printing press to shore up their vision of confession. And of course, this all was very much, you can see here my inspiration for this kind of annal style quantitative history, which I devote a whole chapter to, comes from Raymond Kevorkian's very important work in the 1980s, where he, as a student of Henri Jean Martin, Raymond Kevorkian basically used the annal methodology as well. I would argue things have changed a lot since then, since the 80s, so our knowledge is somewhat different than it was in the 80s. But he came up with dividing books into different genres and doing statistical analysis. But his statistical base was 210 books, or 20, because he focused from 1512 to 1696 or 1699 or early 1700s, and only 250 or so titles had been published. In my statistical analysis of Armenian books, serial history, quantitative history, which I was very lucky to have really talented, brilliant graduate student, Daniel Ohanyan, who very, very kindly, as my research assistant, upon my instructions given to him, created a whole series of data for me using statistical analysis that was based on 960 books as opposed to 210 or 220. And there, the results that came in were that 70% for the whole period were religious and confessional, Secular books were 11% only. There are also mixed books, but if you do a breakdown of the decades of confessional versus secular, you will see that 1700s, 78%, 1710s, 80%, 1740s, 84%, nearly the whole of the output was confessional and religious. And this, of course, is no accident, because in the early 1700s is when confessional strife in Constantinople really becomes intensified. And that's when the three most important Catholic congregations in the Armenian world were born. Well, one of them in Constantinople, Istanbul, the Mkhitarist Order, 1701, at a time when the Armenian Patriarchate was intensely persecuting Catholic Armenians because of these confessional issues. And they were persecuting Catholic Armenians because during the same period, the Ottoman Empire itself was becoming Sunnitized. That is to say, it was becoming a Sunni empire as opposed to a Shia one, which was the case with the Safavids. So confessional-like trends were also there, and the Sheikh al-Islam, at the time, the person in charge of religion in the Ottoman Empire, was a very close friend and supporter of several Armenian patriarchs who ascended the throne and who persecuted Mkhitar, as well as 3 or 4 other Catholic missionaries. And that led to the creation of a Mkhitarist order in Venice eventually. And then, of course, another Armenian Catholic order in Zimmar, and in Rome, the Antonian and the Zimmar order of Catholics, also at the same time as the confessionalism was really heightening in its development. So, yes, I'm going to wrap up very quickly. I'm just going to say 2 things about the importance of confession and nation, and that is that, of course, you may ask, so what? Who cares about confessionalism? Well, people should care, because modern Armenian national identity was secularized only in the 19th century. That is to say, in the post-Tanzimat era of the Ottoman Empire. But most scholars who have looked at the birth of Armenian nationalism use the term ethno-religious, and they argue that Armenians were an ethno-religious community. My argument is that no, they're not ethno-religious, they're ethno-confessional, because the real issues for the Armenians were not other religions. The real issues were confessional divides within Christianity. It was Armenians versus Catholics, and the main target for the Armenian church, and why they used the printing press to such a degree, were, of course, initially the propaganda fide missionaries and so on, or missionaries from France, but eventually from 1750 until 1800, the main targets became the most respectable, reputable Armenian organization today, for us, at least for many of us, the Mkhitarist order in San Lazaro. They were the target. They were used as the what I call them the quintessential avatars of otherness or alterity for the Armenian church. It was Catholic Armenians who were the main threat for Armenian identity, because the Armenian identity that became secularized in the late 19th century was one that was very rigidly defined around confessional lines. You couldn't be a Catholic and an Armenian. You couldn't be a Protestant and an Armenian. You had to be a member of the Armenian church and a follower of Ejmiadzin and the Catholicos. And of course, here, Simeon Yerevansi, a really very important Catholicos from 1710 to in the 1763 to 1780 are his regnal years, and Archbishop Hovsep Arhutians. They were the 2 architects of confessionalism that resorted to the printing press to drive home this message. And of course, their notion of the confessional nation, which is a Catholic nation, was what became secularized when the Tanzimat reforms occurred in the Ottoman Empire and the Armenian National Constitution was ratified in 1863. So by 1879, for instance, if you read articles in the Armenian press, you probably will come across an article by one of my favorite writers of the time, Rafi, a very important public intellectual, who's a nationalist, but in a different sense of the term than now. And he argues that in the old days, Catholics could not be Armenians. Catholics were regarded as not members of the Armenian church. If you're a Protestant, you were not an Armenian. But he says nowadays, Armenianness, and he coins the phrase, he uses the new term, Azkutun, which didn't exist until 1845 in an official basis. Azkutun was different than Azg, which was confessional. Azkutun involved racial categories, language, a political alliance, etc. It's about mostly language and also racialized ways of thinking that were European at that time. And for that, Rafi for me stands as an end point of this debate, because by the time he writes, Armenians are no longer just strictly a confessional nation. The notion of nationness for the Armenians is one that includes Protestants, Catholics, maybe Buddhists, if there were any, or others. And so I will conclude with this, but thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions. Questions?
Yes. Is somebody on there?
Someone's.
Can I ask a question? Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Zorab. Please continue.
Thank you. So, sorry for not opening camera, because in here and it's almost midnight. Dr. Aslanyan, thank you for your amazing speech, and my congratulations with the publication of the book. I study late Middle Ages, 13th and 14th centuries, and when it is before printing houses and printing Armenian printing houses and oral printing. And this period is very interesting from the point of view of developing of use of paper technologies, and how paper just conquered the world. And my question is about, recently I participated in a conference where a scholar showed the map of Ireland, and from the perspective of churches and castles. And it showed, as it became an indicator, how the relations between religious or spiritual classes and secular classes were happening, and castles were symbolic for secular power, and churches were symbols of spiritual classes. And my question is about, as you showed something like this, when you showed the percentage proportion of publication of books, secular books and religious books, do you think that it was the influence of church, or as the publishing houses were founded by mostly merchants, it was also for business purposes to publish religious books, because the demand of religious books was very high? So what about this? It was the influence of churches, Catholic churches, or overall churches, to publish more spiritual books, religious books, or merchants like Jacob Melchapart also had some business purposes to publish spiritual books because they were high in demand. Thank you.
Would it be possible to mute yourself if that's not a problem, because there's a lot of static in the background? And okay, so I would say that in terms of business, I thought I made the point that it wasn't really a profitable business for the Armenians to be in print. People basically relied on patronage, and of course, merchants were the patrons for these books, and they paid for their production. They purchased them in large numbers. They donated them to the church or churchgoers and so forth. So the question then should be, why would merchants be interested in supporting the Armenian confessional identity as opposed to the Catholic one? Well, if you were an Armenian apostolic or a Gregorian, and you had close ties to Ejmiadzin, you were going to be more than likely shoring up and supporting Ejmiadzin's need to struggle against or put up a fight against this kind of missionary incursion into their own fields. And here, of course, even the Makhitaris were seen as, I think Simeon Yerevansi once called them Arvesunk Pokung, small foxes in spoiling the fields of the Armenians. And of course, the merchants put their money behind backed the church with money and resources so that the church would have a chance at a much more superior printing output that was coming out from places like Venice, for instance. So I would say it wouldn't be business, and it would be more than business. It would be a confessional sense of identity, because the merchants themselves define themselves as a confessional nation. Even the most secular ones wouldn't escape the idea of confessionalism. And here, Shamirian, the most secular merchant, publisher of his age, was very much a confessionalist thinker. But I'll leave it at that. Should I host the questions, because I'm feeling like
Would you like to do that?
I can do that? Yes.
There's a question from Artyom too.
Let me moderate, or let me select the questions, because I can see some hands, not all, but I can see some. But I think I'm going to first give the floor to a question by Mr. Iskandarian.
Great talk. I wanted to ask a question about, if you can hone in on maybe the 15% that wasn't religious books. I know in your previous book you said it was the books about weights and measures, for example.
Okay, yeah.
Can you say anything about the reading public, as it were? So I'm slightly mindful of the Madras set, for example, you've already referenced a couple of times. Are they reading that 15%? Are they conscious to I forget who it was, but the popularization of Bharata Armenian Konyan as a myth and legend is partly from publishing at that period, if I'm not mistaken. But I just wanted to hear a bit more about the reading public.
Yes, excellent question. The reading public, we don't know as much as we would like to. Historians are always facing the problem of the balance of knowledge. Like, we know there are a lot of things we don't know about the past that the past actors themselves knew, and there are a lot of things that they knew that we don't, that they didn't know that we know, because we have archival information and so forth. But our knowledge of reading publics and how much literacy there was is very, very thin, I would say. Most readers were religious or confessional until the late 18th century. But to the extent that the reading public did exist, and there were, of course, some readers, I would say that those who were literate, probably a majority of them were not literate in Armenian. In the 18th century, one of the fastest growing areas of Armenian print was in a genre that is referred to by some scholars as heterographic or allographic. And that is basically, I'm referring to Armeno-Turkish, which is Anatolian Turkish, vernacular Turkish, written in the Armenian script. So that would be the closest to a vernacular that Armenians had. Most Armenians were not fluent. They could not understand grapar, the classical language of the church. To the extent that they spoke and communicated in Armenian, they had dialectal differences. So there was also this, there were a few languages a few idioms that were invented at that time to deal with issues of literacy and so on, these problems that I referred to. One of these was a language called Katsiagan Hayren, or civil Armenian, which is basically an earlier form of Ashkharapar. So the book of measures and weights that you referred to, Gans, Chapo, Gishro, Dramits, Dramo, Polor, Ashkharim, that book, published in Amsterdam, 1699, was written in a kind of civil Armenian. It's a vernacular language that was mixed with classical. It's a hybrid kind of classical vernacular. So to the extent that there was literacy, people were able to read books of that sort. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm working on this topic of language right now in terms of vernacular publishing at this time. Very few books were published in the vernacular, like 1%. I think, according to the tabulations I have, only 1%, 4% in Armeno-Turkish, 1% in Ashkharapar or Katsiagan Hayren.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I think Artyom Tonoyan has a question, and I'm going to choose him because I like Artyom. Artyom?
Thank you, Sebu. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. The question I have just popped in my head as I was listening. Did these Armenian publishers publish books strictly in the Armenian language, or did they have some side gigs? I don't know, Molière translated into Italian and they decided to print it in Venice. And how regulated these publishing houses were at the time? Would they have to get certain permissions to do this foreign language, or they were just allowed to publish in their own native languages?
Sure, but even when they published foreign authors, and that's a very interesting question you've asked, thank you. Even when they published foreign authors, they published them in translation. So translation was a very important aspect of the printing revolution in the 18th century. There were a number of very important works translated from European languages into semblance of Garapar, or a mixed alloy of Garapar and Ashkarapar, sometimes in Garapar, but maybe not highfalutin Garapar. So yes, there were some translations that appeared in the 18th century, but the heyday of translations of European authors particularly was the 19th century, and that's not early modern anymore, that's the modern period, and it lies beyond my purview of expertise or interest. But that's when the Mokhtars played a very important role in that, publishing all these European authors. Molière, I'm not sure, but certainly a very important person who was published was Les Aventures de Télémaque, I forget, Fénelon's book. But that was published in the 19th century, 3-4 editions in the 19th century. But the first edition was published in Nor Nakhichevan in 1794, so early modern.
Thank you.
Please. Yes, what's your name?
Edward.
Yes, Edward.
Great talk. Appreciate
Thank
it. I was interested, there's been a lot of stuff recently written about the British East India Company. William Dalrymple's written this book recently for The Anarchy, and in it he says that European merchants realized that Jewish and Armenian communities were the only ones who could sustain long distance voyages due to the level of trust between them, and so they had to set up these new companies to be able to do the long distance trade. And it's just interesting how I don't know, you maybe know better than me, but there hasn't really been that much written about the relationship between Armenian communities and the trading companies and the development of kind of, I mean, they're the first multinational corporations really, and it seems like and there's a line in the book about how Indian rulers, the Mughals, they thought the British were going to be like Armenians and come in and just help them run the economy for them, help them, and obviously that's not what happened. But I was just wondering if you knew of other kind of writings about this topic, because I think it's maybe something British historians are missing out on. Sure,
that's a great question. Thank you. My first book is on precisely this question to some extent, and it's called From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean: The Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa. And there I broach the topic of the European companies and what made the Armenians different from them. And in a nutshell, to water it down for the purposes of a short answer, I can say yes. The differences were that the Armenians operated with family firms that were Asian in nature. They were based on agnatic families, patriarchal, and with many, many members. And of course, this was not the case with the East India companies, although families did have important role as well. But in the East India Company case, with the British East India, English East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, they were the first, as you say, the first multinationals in the world. They were also unique because they had joint stock. Joint stock is pretty much, there are very few things that are uniquely European, but joint stock is certainly one of them, I would say. And so, yes, the Armenians integrated much more successfully in Asian communities because they were part of the larger fabric of those societies. And unlike the British East India Company, the Armenian firms, especially the Julfan firms, were not known to have cannon mounted on their ships and to blow the competition into smithereens if the price was not right. So, but of course, in the case of the English East India Company, we're dealing with a multinational corporation that was actually a company state. So they operated like state-like entities. The Armenians were not that. And that's why in Bengal, the Armenians were very, very well accepted and welcomed in Mughal domains. And often enough, they were the people who were the go-betweens to allow the East India Company to establish settlements, fortified settlements. Calcutta owes its origin to some extent to Khoja Israel di Sarhad, an Armenian merchant from Julfa. Mazuli Patam in the south, French East India Company, Compagnie des Indes Orientales, established a base thanks to an Armenian Julfan who was one of their directors, Markara Avashins. I've written an article on him. And I have also an article, if you're interested, on Julfan agreements with foreign states and East India companies that deals precisely with this question.
Amazing.
If you're interested.
Sorry.
Thank you. Please, thank you. Noritza, yes.
That was really striking. There was so much you gave us, but the mind boggles in an hour.
It
I
took
was-
long
I-
enough. Yes. Sorry.
I was thinking when I was in Vienna of the library of newspapers, we haven't touched at all on that, obviously, because it's a much later period. But could you just
Yes.
give us an idea of
Yeah.
how the Armenian newspaper developed as well in the diaspora?
Sure. In passing, I can say this much. The reason why the early modern period to me is so important is because there's a noticeable shift from land to maritime optics, as I call it, following some Jerry Bentley. And I would argue that in the early modern period, the Center for Armenian Elite Cultural History, which is largely in the form of print culture, shifted from land to the seas and to port cities. And the most important developments in early modern Armenian history were all came about as a result of maritime transportation. So if you look at the first Armenian newspaper in the world, Azdarar, published in Madras from 1794 to 96 for a year and a half. It's squarely in the early modern period. And again, Shahamir Shamiryan's press, his printing machine was actually what was used to publish it. And, but of course, this was a one-off thing at the tail end of my period. And then, of course, in the early 1800s, there are several other newspapers in Venice. There's Byzantion, there are a few others. And then, of course, the real heyday of Armenian print culture when it comes to journalism and newspapers is the 19th century, 1840-41. You have the birth of Arshaluis Araradian, Smyrna, the largest, most trans-imperial Armenian press with a real public sphere, because readers existed in India, in Astrakhan, in France, all over the world. They had a membership subscription base that was truly hemispheric. But that's mostly modern, mostly 19th century. But the origins are in the early modern period and are connected to maritime transportation, maritime locations. Yes. Can you tell me your name? Sorry. Of course, yes.
Yeah, that
Yes,
was very interesting.
please.
Thank you so much.
Please.
I was wondering, in different contexts, I've come across, I guess, every time there was the rise of the printing press, there would be significant backlash from the traditional manuscript producing
Yes.
and book producing classes. You mentioned the collapse of the scribal classes in Eastern Anatolia at the time, due to these two historical uprisings, the July uprisings and Shah Abbas the First rule. Did that sort of mean that comparatively there would have been less of a backlash against the rise of these printing presses, which were more in further ports, I guess, further away, or was there still some backlash and some resistance?
Excellent. Yes, definitely. I talk about this topic in my chapter on Julfan print, or the arrival of print in Safavid Iran. And there, the big difference, of course, I do a comparative analysis of Islamicate or Islamic print versus Armenian print and Sephardic Jewish print. And what I argue is that there is a very early convergence between Armenian and Sephardic traditions of print. Both of them are port city based, and both of them rely on maritime transportation, maritime facilities, and so forth. And both of them rely on port Armenians or port Jews. In the case of Islamic print, of course, up until recently, there's been quite a bit of heated debate on this topic. And the question people were asking, which is the wrong question, was why did the Islamic world have come so late to printing? First printing press in Iran was an Armenian printing press, 1636 to, and then 1692. The first Arabic script print in Iran is 1819, 1822. It's only a 19th century phenomenon. So, of course, the question is what explains this difference? And the answer in part is that in the Islamic world, scribes, as you alluded to very, very accurately, put up a very stiff resistance to this newcomer from the West, printing, because there were thousands, tens of thousands of scribes who made a living on this in writing manuscripts. So printing was seen as a kind of unwelcome and unnecessary intrusion. In the Armenian world, the scribes, I argue, who were the main opponents in the Islamic world for print, were largely, in some ways, nullified as a result of the twin detonations that I talked about. There was very little resistance to print. In fact, the Armenian church, unlike the Islamic case, grabbed the bull of print technology by both horns very early on, because they knew that that was their only option of competing with the missionaries, because the missionaries were using the very same technology as well. And the one case where there was opposition to print in the Armenian world was in Julfa. And that happened in 1646. And it's too long of a story, but there's a very sad episode I recount in the book of a printer named Hovannes Jughayetsi, who's sent by the primate of New Julfa, Gesaratsi, I forget his name at the moment, the first name. Anyway, Hovannes was sent to Europe to perfect the art of printing because the local means of printing were not sufficient. They were making ink on the spot, they were making their own paper, and the paper in Iran was not suitable for print because when you press down on the press, it would crack. European paper was seen as much more durable and more suitable for printing. And so this guy, Hovannes, traveled for 7-8 years in Europe. He went to Livorno, he went to Rome, Venice, and incredibly, I've never seen anybody who suffered that much to finally succeed in bringing a printing press from Livorno, mounted on camels from Jerusalem or Acre straight to Isfahan. And he succeeded in bringing the press. He assembled the press, everything, and he printed one mediocre book of 57 pages in 1646 after all the suffering he endured. And then the scribes rose up against him because his supporter Gesaratsi was no longer alive when he came back. Gesaratsi was the person who had sent him. And the priests who were there were vehemently opposed to this new technology, and the scribes were a very important opposition to that. And he was forced to break down his press. And of course, he was killed in old Julfa. It's a very sad story, but his ordeals were very moving when I was researching it. Yeah, please. Yes, yes, please.
Were there any non-priests who knew Armenian well enough to supervise printing?
Yes, of course. There were some.
Okay.
I can give you one very interesting, colorful example. Shamir Shamirian's press in Madras, the first Armenian printing press in India, 1771. Right? His printing press produced some of the most revolutionary books in Armenian culture, in retrospect. Of course, the question is, who was he using to help with pulling down the lever? Who was he using to set type? You need compositors, you need typesetters, and so on. And to be a typesetter, you need to identify and know Armenian script. It's not easy. People who were working with him were from Thailand. He owned slaves who were Chinese by origin from Thailand, Chenats Ashkharits, and he refers to them as like Vartan Mamikonian from China, although we know that not Vartan Mamikonian. I'm confusing it. I'm obviously tired, but yes, okay, yes, you're right. So he names his compositors who were basically manipulated and converted to Armenian Christianity, confessionalized, became Armenians, and helped them set type. They're named in his books. In Holland, they were Dutch typesetters. They're named as well, like Jan Rickelman was a Dutch compositor who worked with Voskan Yerevanti, and they're also named. So there were people who knew the types.
Could I ask?
Please.
Because that was very much related to what I was going to ask about the context of publishing in places like India. What kind of cooperation was there? What kind of mixing and of ideas and borrowing from each other? These different groups that you've mentioned.
Sure. Well, This goes back to a topic that Richard and I were talking about earlier, that is that port cities. Right? If you look at port cities, they're centers of innovation, of diversity, of multiplicity of religious groups, language groups, and so on. So, of course, there are places where information flows are also more dense. And of course, when you look at a place like Madras, it's not coincidental that it's the place where the first Armenian proto-constitution was written, because they were writing in the 1780s and referring to George Washington, for instance, and the American Revolution. So there was a lot of, there was a circulation of ideas, not only within India itself, but especially from other quarters, particularly across the Indian Ocean from Europe. So a kind of innovation mostly occurs in world history when people mix, when people encounter each other across cultural boundaries, you have innovation. And a lot of the innovations of this period took place in port cities precisely because of cross-cultural encounters. But I'm not able to give you a more precise response.
And one of the words you mentioned what happens in these cities earlier at the beginning, just to come back to that. I think another thing that happens there is curiosity is peaked much more so than in other places where life doesn't change that much from day to day.
Definitely, yeah.
So
Not just pure curiosity, but also mobility itself, which is the core theme of my book, itself gives rise to, in the 7th, 18th century, to what in the Armenian context, to what Stephen Greenblatt, a well-known authority on the Renaissance, calls self-fashioning. The idea of the self as something distinct that needs to be, that is malleable, that can be shaped and reshaped, is something that enters in this period the Armenian context because of mobility and because of these cross-cultural encounters. And curiosity. Curiosity is, of course, at the root of, in some ways, of self-fashioning. You want to craft yourself to be different in some ways because of the experience that you have with meeting others. Otherness, alterity is a key driving engine of innovation, I think. I'm essentializing.
No, I think you have a very good point. And it was a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry I spoke too long.
Great. I'm sure we're all buzzing with ideas and have many more questions, but if we could continue over wine, and we've got some cheese and crackers here as well, that would be great. We have another book talk in 10 days time with Aykut Öztürk, who's going to be talking about Armenian mobility again, but in the 21st century, between Armenia and Istanbul and around Istanbul. So I welcome you all back to hear that. We happily accept £5 if you can manage it for our treats, and hope that you can come back. We'll be continuing through the summer, but really gathering speed in the autumn. And thank you for coming, and thank you, sir, for your fabulous talk.
Thank you, Susan. It was great. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry we don't have
Very
more
pleasant to be here.
of these, but you can certainly get them on Amazon.
Amazon, yes.
But we weren't able to get any for tonight, and we will have one in our book. You can come to the library and read it here. It's a traditional thing to do.
Amazon is better, but yes.
Amazon. Because the author will get so
Thank you.
rich off.
Yes,
right?
of course. That's why we do it.
That's why we do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.